And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for staying with us. I'm very pleased to welcome three gentlemen from the Christic Institute. This is going to be a very fascinating program, and I'm going to ask that you stay with us, as I'm very pleased to welcome the Christic Institute's Chief General Counsel, and that is Mr. Daniel Sheehan. Also, I have from the West Coast office, I have their West Coast Director, Father Bill Davis. And I also have, and very pleased to welcome to from around Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Executive Director, Mr. Jim Shrider. Gentlemen, thank you all for coming down from around Los Angeles. It's very much a pleasure to have you here. And let me begin with yourself, Mr. Sheehan. You're currently very much embroiled in a case against our government. In the short amount of time that we do have here, can you orientate our audience as to first what the Christic Institute is all about, and secondly, the case that you're currently involved in?
Sure, Gary. The Christic Institute is the public interest law firm and public policy center in Washington, D.C. that is made up of the people who came together originally to do the Karen Silkwood case back in 1975. This group came together and eventually won the Karen Silkwood case in 1979, winning the $10.5 million judgment for Karen's children, sustained it all the way through to the Supreme Court, and then put together a public interest law firm that is tax deductible, that works primarily with the social ministry offices of the mainstream religious denominations in the country, and does investigations and civil litigation to bring to the public's attention specific public policy problems. We did all the litigation at 3 Mile Island, for example, to get the court orders compelling a government-supervised cleanup of that facility. We prosecuted the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party down in Greensboro, North Carolina, for gunning down the labor demonstrators down there. We did the first sanctuary trial down in southern Texas, the first criminal defense, and succeeded in establishing the legal doctrine that the Immigration and Naturalization Service, when they're violating the law, cannot prosecute people for attempting to assist bona fide refugees in the country. It was through that latter case that we uncovered the existence in 1984 of an off-the-shelf, standalone criminal covert operations enterprise that was smuggling weapons out of the United States down to the Contras in Central America in violation of the law, in direct contradiction to a prohibition by Congress. And we also discovered that they were smuggling massive amounts of cocaine back into the United States to help finance this criminal enterprise in Latin America, since there was no government funding allowed for it. That led to the discovery of a terrorist bombing directed by this off-the-shelf enterprise in May of 1984 against a press conference being held by Eden Pastora, a former military leader of the Sandinista Revolution, against Nicaragua's dictator, Anastasio Somoza. When this attempted assassination took place, several international journalists were assassinated in this attack on May 30th of 1984 at a little town in Nicaragua called La Penca. And we were retained by the ABC Evening News television cameraman, Tony Avergan, who survived that terrorist bombing attack, was hospitalized, and then worked with an American Newspaper Guild grant to investigate, to ascertain who had committed that bombing. Along with his wife, they conducted this investigation. Martha Honey, the national public radio reporter from Costa Rica, came to the conclusion that a millionaire expatriate American who lived in Costa Rica, a member of John Hull, had been the mastermind behind this terrorist bombing to try to assassinate Eden Pastora for the Contras. Our initial investigations out of the Christic Institute that had arisen earlier had led us to the conclusion that a large amount of this military equipment that was being criminally smuggled from the United States was in fact being smuggled to the ranch of John Hull, so that we had a dovetailing of these two investigations by the end of May of 1984. And we were then asked by Martha Honey and Tony Avergan to file a major federal lawsuit against the individuals that were involved in this criminal assassination operation. And we then discovered that this was only part of, or just a single venture of, indeed, a much more long-standing, ongoing federal criminal racketeering enterprise involving not just the smuggling of cocaine and the illegal sale of weapons, but a pattern of criminal assassinations that were being prosecuted by the men who had been fired from the United States government by President Carter from 1976 to 1980 after the panoply of revelations of criminal conduct by people in the covert operations section of the CIA. These men had put together, it turns out, a private company called the International Research and Trade Corporation, and under the auspices of this private company now had continued to pursue the same pattern of criminal activity for which they had been condemned and fired. Now that turned into the federal racketeering lawsuit that was filed in Miami in the federal court in May of 1986, some 6 months prior to the public revelations by the Attorney General in November of the existence of this off-the-shelf enterprise and the fact that they'd been caught selling tow missiles to Iran and pilfering money and giving it to the Contras. So the Christic Institute found itself in the center of this massive international expose going on revealing the existence of this group, and have been working for some years now to try to get the United States Congress and the Justice Department and the Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh to take an honest look at the scale of this enterprise, to understand that it's a lot more than just one fairly over-exuberant young lieutenant colonel who sort of recruited a bunch of retired CIA guys on an ad hoc basis simply to try to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. That is not what this is. It's a long-standing criminal racketeering enterprise made up of the very men that George Bush had supervised when he was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency back in 1976 in their pattern of criminal conduct. That's who they are. It leads all the way up into the Bush administration. These men were in fact supervised by the National Security Advisor of George Bush, Donald Gregg, with full knowledge of the Vice President. The Vice President has lied consistently in office, and later when he became President, has continued to lie consistently, was intimately involved in this criminal operation, has in fact committed impeachable offenses, and should be brought to the bar of justice.
Wow, this sounds like a bad movie. That's a pretty incredible scenario. So basically, Mr. Sheehan, what you're saying is that we have a bunch of individuals, ex-CIA individuals, fired by Carter, who are now running around and supplying weapons illegally to Central America, and I can assume to the Middle East. Bill Davis, West Coast director of the Christic Institute. That's pretty unbelievable. I mean, is the public ready for this?
Well, they probably aren't because they've been given so much force-fed ignorance, but on the other hand, there's another sense in which they are, because when you talk to people about this stuff and you lay it out to them, it touches a chord of doubt. I think many, many people know in their gut that they've been lied to over the years. They kind of have the feeling that the Tower Commission and these various commissions tell us what they would like us to think rather than what is real. And so I found that, you know, conservative, liberal, it cuts across ideological lines. If you lay out for people the facts and show them that this is coherent, it's evil, but it's coherent, it makes sense, people will believe it. And they do want to do something about it because they see, I think, instinctively that it's not just the Sandinistas or the Iranians or people who are hurt by it. Ultimately, it's our lives that are in the balance. It's the U.S. democracy that's at stake here.
And Mr. Jim Shrider, as newly appointed executive director of the Los Angeles branch, this is quite a challenge that you're taking on here in Los Angeles. How do you perceive your role within the Christic Institute, in so much as that they're really fighting an enormous case right now?
Well, I think I want to emphasize that we're not in the business of scaring people, but in educating people. We do have a good following from a presence in Los Angeles over the past 3 or 4 years. And for example, we just had a large concert in Los Angeles by Bruce Springsteen, Bonnie Raitt, and Jackson Browne, which shows the kind of support in this community that sees these issues and wants to give people the message. So I think what we're trying to do is let people know what's happening, give them a choice to opt to follow their responsibilities as citizens of a democracy and to become active in supporting us and learning more.
Daniel, do you believe that the Christic Institute is gaining or getting, I should say, the support that you feel is necessary?
Well, it's a process, Gary. When you communicate information to people like this, at the first instance, there's a sort of a denial process, of a refusal to want to believe this type of thing on behalf of the former Central Intelligence Agency people and the people who we have trusted for a long time. But this was very similar to what we encountered when we began the Karen Silkwood case, telling people about the dangers of the private nuclear industry, suggesting that there was a serious threat as early as 1975, that a major nuclear catastrophe could take place, that these places could melt down, the people around the area could be placed in danger. We talked about the Hanford facility up in Washington State, trying to tell people that the low-level radiation emissions from these facilities were dramatically more damaging to their health than was being acknowledged by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We succeeded, I think, in communicating that information to people, using not only the vehicle of public education in television shows and public discussions, but litigation, to bring it before an independent jury. If you take 12 men and women selected at random and you put them in a jury box, and it tends to focus the national attention. It puts it in very simple terms of saying, here are the fact questions, here are citizens like you selected at random who have listened to this evidence. They have come to a conclusion at the close of a trial where both sides have the opportunity to present their evidence and to present their first-hand witnesses in admissible form through a whole process of law. They have come to the conclusion that what the Christic Institute is saying is completely true. Now, that is what we have done regularly and consistently, basically on behalf of the American people in the social ministry offices of the major religious denominations, to focus these public interest questions, to set it up in a forum pursuant to which people can place credibility in the kind of conclusions that are come to by fellow citizens just like themselves. So I believe that this process, clearly now, the American people are perfectly aware of the fact that there is in fact an off-the-shelf operation, an enterprise, that they have been engaged in massive smuggling of cocaine, that in fact they have been engaged in political assassinations, that we have come up with definite proof already establishing the vast bulk of these charges. The real issue that still remains to be addressed is understanding the full scope of this enterprise, the fact that it has not been closed down by getting rid of General Secord and getting rid of Oliver North, that this is an operation that is run by Theodore Shackley, the man who directed covert operations for the CIA worldwide under George Bush when he was the director of the CIA. This is still the man that runs secret covert operations for George Bush worldwide, though he does it now in a private capacity so that it can be kept out from under the supervision of the United States Congress and the intelligence committees. The American people have a strong suspicion that this is true. The Christic Institute is going to present the evidence in trial to a federal jury down in Florida in 1992. And we're going to present this information, and the American people are going to come to see that this is true, and then have to decide what steps need to be taken to eliminate this criminal enterprise from the American body politic.
Is Mr. Bush out of the loop within this criminal enterprise, or is he in the loop?
Well, he's very much in the loop, Gary, very much in the loop. It's not that he runs it, because he is more a person who gets manipulated some by this. This was a group that existed in power before Bush became the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, before he became vice president or president. This is a group that has its own kind of bureaucratic momentum. It's like the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about in 1960 when he left office, saying, beware of the military-industrial complex, that it will gobble up your public treasury, it will get you involved in foreign entanglements, very much as President Washington reminded us, the first president, of beware of a standing army who will do those types of things. What we now see is that there is an additional group, which is the Central Intelligence Agency's criminal covert operations sections, that this, like a standing army and like the military-industrial complex, is a bureaucracy that develops its own momentum, its own agenda, and it becomes fundamentally unconstitutional and anti-democratic. It is what we've been warned about by all political scientists, not to have a secret political police force, because they will turn their talents that have been honed outside of the country back upon the democratic process as soon as the American people refuse to support their mission. And that's exactly what we see happening now. They're so dedicated to this constant anti-communist mission that they've been sort of born and bred to, that when the American people say, that era has passed, the Cold War is over, It is time for us now to turn toward readjusting our economy and our priorities. These men feel excluded. They feel abandoned. And they're going to continue their criminal operations, seeking out new enemies, now trying to define third world countries that might interfere with the continued privileged access of the northern industrial nations to the strategic raw materials that they believe that we're entitled to. And they're going to now start to target these people, call them terrorists, call them people who are opposed to American interests. This needs to be eliminated from the American body politic. And it can only be done through a sharp conflict of this nature in a court of law, subject to the rules of law, and subject to the perusal of the American public, so that they can see what's happening and find out what their fellow citizens have come to believe based upon all the evidence.
Bill, it sounds like the Christic Institute is taking on the nastiest section of the Central Intelligence Agency. That's somewhat of a scary thing, isn't it?
Not really. We're taking on some nasty areas of untruth, and whether it's a Central Intelligence Agency or others, that is scary to some extent, but it's also comforting in knowing that there's a bottom line there. There's solid ground. There is a weapon, if you will, of truth that really has a power to it that goes beyond their powers. So, you know, I wanted to come back to something you said earlier when you mentioned that this stuff is unbelievable. It's surprising, it's shocking, but it's not unbelievable. It really is, you know, strictly speaking, very believable. And once you document it and lay out the evidence, and there is a lot of evidence now, not just what the Christic Institute has garnered, but we have, you know, books and videotapes and other forms of documented evidence that people can get and can decide for themselves whether they find this believable. Because if it's true, then I don't care, rightist, leftist, whatever. If it's true, it's very important that we learn about it and that we get on top of it.
Jim, the volunteers that are coming down to the Los Angeles office, how aware are they of what the Christic Institute, or the scope and level of the endeavors of the Christic Institute currently?
I'd say we have a very sophisticated group of volunteers. They're very enthusiastic about what we're doing. And I want to emphasize that one of the aspects of their interest has to do with the fact that this Christic Institute tries to link political action with spirituality and tries to see perhaps a link between political action, spirituality, in giving people the opportunity to know the truth and to make choices from that point.
As we just have a few minutes remaining, Dan, let me ask you about the Gulf War that we recently won. Your secret team that you've been talking about was very much involved in this Gulf conflict. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Oh, very much, Gary. For example, stating it most starkly, it's extremely important for people to know that the Christic Institute is in possession of a certified Central Intelligence Agency transcript of a conversation that took place between Oliver North, Richard Secord, and Albert Hakim on the one hand, and the so-called second channel of the Iranian government back in 1985, a relative of Rafsanjani, that this was a conversation in which the secret team was making its promise to transfer the TOW missiles to the Iranian government, to break the law, to engage in criminal violations of the Arms Export Control Act, which became the basis of the scandal for Iran-Contra. But there was a second part of the promise in this October 29th, 1985 meeting, in which on the transcript it shows that Oliver North and Richard Secord and Albert Hakim promised as a second portion of the agreement with the Iranian government that the Reagan and then Bush administrations would overthrow the government of Saddam Hussein.
Going as far back as 6 years ago.
This is 1985, that this was a dual part of the agreement, in addition to giving the TOW missiles to Iran, that they would take steps to see to it that the Bush administration overthrew Saddam Hussein and the Iranian government. Now, this is extremely important to understand in the context of the follow-up, in which some $50 billion worth of military equipment was illegally sold by Richard Secord's enterprise through a man by the name of Sarkis Saganalian. He was as Ghubbanifar was to the Iranians, Sarkis Saganalian was to the Iranians. They sold $50 billion worth of military equipment, totally criminally, just as criminally as the sale of TOW missiles to Iran was, to build this man up, to make him a power to be able to then turn around and overthrow Iran. Now, this extraordinarily stupid policy of of building up one side to beat the other and building up then the other side to fight back the other and to destabilize that entire area of the world has now led to the requirement of sending 500,000 American citizens in there to be placed in harm's way, to have been faced with potential catastrophe in there, though as it turns out, the catastrophe has been one that has been basically heaped upon the Iranian people and the Kuwaiti people and the environment, I might add. You know, I mean, absolute destruction. When you're trying to figure out what the costs are and the benefits of what we're obtaining from what might have been conceivably obtained through diplomatic channels without the loss of perhaps 100,000 lives of Iranian citizens, primarily women and children and non-combatants, to say nothing of the 300 lives of the Allies in that. You know, the vast cost, which is still going on, of oil fields burning out of control, the hugest oil spill in the entire history of the human family. As a matter of fact, the foreign minister from Jordan is going to be speaking to the United Nations this week about the total catastrophe that's going on. I think that General Schwarzkopf, for example, who is an extraordinarily intelligent and appealing man, you know, when he comes to the point of retiring, ought to take it upon himself to talk to the American people about the devastation to the economy that's taken place in there, and ought to spend some of his considerable skills in communicating, talking about how we should cut ourselves off now from petroleum, that we should not be dependent upon this thing. It'll lead us into these kind of wars, to use the kind of talents that have been devoted and impressed the world in the military capacity for peace and for a stable ecology in that area of the world. That's the kind of thing that people have to start thinking about now.
So basically, if I understand you, what you're saying is then that the American public was pretty much bamboozled into believing that this war was necessary.
Oh, absolutely. James Webb, who was the Secretary of Navy for Ronald Reagan, not a liberal man, has specifically stated to the Washington Times in Washington, D.C., that he has become completely convinced that the American people were intentionally manipulated into this war by President Bush and his administration. The purpose of it was to demonstrate that the military was not going to be cut out of the massive military budget. They weren't going to lose their $300 billion a year, that they were going to insist upon having a new role, that they were going to turn away from strategic warfare with the Soviet Union into a more conventional and low-intensity type of warfare against these third-world nations that might threaten to interfere with access to the strategic raw materials that the northern industrial states, now led in a new world order by the United States, had access to. Now, that's what the whole purpose of this choreography was all about. And no matter how many times April Glaspie gets on and tries to tell people that, on second thought, she thinks she made it very clear to Saddam Hussein that he shouldn't really go into Kuwait, no one is going to believe her. I mean, no one objectively is going to believe her. The fact is that the evidence is overwhelming that this thing was choreographed and that he was led into doing these kind of stupid things. The fact that he had a proclivity toward doing them to begin with is not the controlling issue here. For the Bush administration to have made the calculated decision that the expenditure of the thousands and thousands and thousands of human lives and the absolute disaster to the economies of that area of the world, the political stability of that area of the world, and the ecology of that part of the world was worth what? Was it not worth spending several more months, if necessary, to try to solve this problem diplomatically, when it's clear that the assertions that were being made by the Bush administration of the dire need on an emergency basis to rush in because the people of Kuwait were being tortured, because the incubators were being taken away and the babies were dying, it's been shown to be completely untrue. That stuff was not true at the time, and they knew that it was not true at the time. The people have been manipulated in the same way that we were into giving them support earlier, the other administrations, to go into the Vietnam War, told that somehow that our USS Henry Knox, you know, steaming in international waters, was attacked in Tonkin Bay. Completely untrue, absolutely fabricated, in that instance by a Democratic administration, in this particular instance by a Republican administration. That the American people cannot tolerate this type of manipulation and deception, and the Christic Institute is here with many other organizations to show what the facts are, to bring this before a court of law, and have this resolved by the American people.
And Bill, as Danny says, the evidence that the Christic Institute is showing is supported by many other organizations. I mean, the facts are there, the evidence is there. Let me ask you this just a little facetiously. Why should the American public, with all those facts in place, believe you when they can sit at home and watch Dan Rather and be happy?
Yeah, the Joe Sixpack argument. There are many who don't want to hear this kind of thing, but I think most people in this country are incredibly good and right-thinking. They want what's fair, and they want fundamentally to be a government of the people, which cannot happen if this trend continues. So why should they care? If they want to preserve democracy, if they want this country to be in any form of a constitutional democracy, they better care. I think they better care, though, from a deep spiritual sense of what is right. You know, when people are lied to consistently and manipulated, the longer they're lied to and the more they're deceived, the angrier they are when they find out what really happened. And, you know, we've seen that before with Nixon, for instance. I think we'll see it again. I think it's important that people go for the truth and find it.
Danny, you're going to...
Yeah, I'd like to point out,
we just have a few seconds.
Just in closing, that there's been a major white paper prepared by the Christic Institute on the Gulf War and the relationship of the war to the covert operations and the off-the-shelf enterprise of Richard Secord and Albert Hakim. The people can get that from the Christic Institute here in the Los Angeles office. Just call up information.
Let's give that number now, why don't we?
And they can get the paper.
Yeah, and that's a very something you definitely want to do, and that number you need to call is 287-1556. Again, you see it on your screen. Give a call, 287-1556. You can obtain the paper that Mr. Sheehan just referred to, and if you want to volunteer any of your time or any of your resources, I'm sure they'll be happy to assist you. Unfortunately, gentlemen, we're all out of time. Danny, I want to thank you for taking some time out of your schedule. It was a pleasure. As usual, Father Bill, it was very much a pleasure. And Jim Shrider, best of luck to your new position at the Christic Institute. Thank you all once again. And I want to thank you for watching this edition of From Around Los Angeles, everybody. I hope you found it informative. Thanks for watching. I'm Gary Cox from Around Los Angeles.